Hey, how you doing? This is Chris Franklin with Core Health. I want to talk to you today about the thyroid, its role in the body, and how you can optimize it to maximize your metabolism so that you can minimize the amount of fat. If you're like many people, as you age, you feel like your metabolism slows down. Sometimes as you get older, you start feeling cold all the time. Is it really the change in the temperature, or is it maybe your metabolism is slowing down? Maybe your thyroid is reducing its production. One of the biggest roles of thyroid is to regulate the body's core temperature. That's done through the release of two hormones known as thyroxine, or T4, and T3. The biggest difference between those two is the number of iodine attached to them. So what we're going to look at today is, one, how do we get our brain to tell our thyroid to produce more of it? How do we reach an optimal level? And then what supplements can we take to actually improve our body's production of it? Because ideally, we would want our body to produce its own thyroid versus trying to take a synthetic form such as thyroxine. One of the problems with taking any type of thyroid medication is that the thyroid itself, the T4, works as a negative feedback on the brain to begin to tell it to stop producing thyroid. So when we take thyroxine as a prescription, our brain picks up that T4 and tells it to stop producing TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. So in a perfect state, or in an optimal world, what we would want to do is have our brain tell it to produce more TSH so that our own bodies can produce more T4 and T3. That can be accomplished through a combination of functional therapies and supplementation. You may or may not still need medical recommendations, but it's ideal to optimize your body, get the right nutrients, and ensure that it's able to work. So first we have to look at what is thyroxine. Since this is the parent hormone that's going to be circulating through the body, it's produced in the thyroid, which is located in our neck. How do we get that molecule? What is that made out of? Well, thyroxine is basically a dimer, which just means two parts, of the amino acid L-tyrosine. That tyrosine has also been iodinated. It's basically through a certain enzyme known as thyroperoxidase. Iodine from our diet is then converted into iodine and then reacted to form either monoiota tyrosine or diiota tyrosine. Now, depending on how those two pieces are put together, whether it's two diiota tyrosine residues, that would give us T4. And if it's one monoiota tyrosine plus a diiota tyrosine, we end up producing T3. And overall, the ratio that's produced by the thyroid, about 70% is T4, with only 30% of it coming from being produced as T3. That's important because, as we said earlier, T4 is also more of a precursor to the active T3 hormone. Imagine your body has plenty of T4 circulating, and whenever it senses that it needs to adapt, increase the metabolic rate, raise the core temperature, then it converts through something known as dihydrogenase, which basically removes one of the iodine from the thyroxine to produce the active residue, or T3. Depending on where that enzyme can be located will depend. There's basically three basic types of that dihydrogenase enzyme. If it is type 2, that's located in the brown fat. That's why you hear about brown fat in the body has a metabolic effect to be able to burn fat. That's because brown fat actually has thyroid receptors, or T3 receptors on it, which signal the body to begin to release those triglycerides to be burned. In our previous video, we talked about how to get the body to release it through using a combination of catecholamines, MIC, and other supplements to get our body to release them. The other mechanism is by optimizing the thyroid. As T3 binds to brown fat, that increases the thermogenic activity. It raises the core temperature. Your body also does this in response to when you're outside. If you've ever been out in the winter, probably not in Louisiana, but in other states that actually get cold, you'll find that your body begins to shiver. You feel cold. That's partly due to your body trying to increase its core temperature. So right off the bat, we hear of two things that our body absolutely has to have to be able to produce thyroxine. What is that? L-tyrosine and iodine. If we do not have those, if we're deficient in those, our body will not be able to produce sufficient thyroxine or T3. The other critical elements are actually trace elements, and that is selenium and iron. Selenium plays a role both in the thyroid peroxidase, which is the incorporation of the iodine into the tyrosine residue, because to convert iodide, which is an iodine with a minus symbol, an extra electron, to convert it into iodine, which would be I2, or in electron neutral, electronegative neutral state, it requires a redox reaction. Selenium is the metal that catalyzes the redox reaction. Iron is also a part of that, because once the selenium is oxidized, it has to be reduced, and iron cord centers in thyroglobulin are what that part is incorporated in. So we need basically sufficient iodine levels, tyrosine, selenium, and iron for our body to be able to produce thyroxine and T3. So basically those supplements. Now, what is the most bioavailable? Typically we find with iron, not all iron supplements are the same. What we found overall in terms of absorption is an iron bisglycinate, which basically means that iron is coordinated against two glycine residues. The other one we find for selenium is when you find something called seleniomethionine, which is, if you can imagine, the amino acid methionine, which is got a sulfur group at the second to last position on the side chain, has now been substituted with selenium. Why is that capable of working? If you look at your periodic table, sulfur and selenium are within the same group, but one period lower. That's why selenium can be substituted in. This is the most bioavailable form of selenium for the body. So if you have sufficient iodine, you supplement with the seleniomethionine, and then an iron that's a bisglycinate, along with tyrosine, your body now has all of the precursor materials available to it so that it's able to now produce. What I typically use whenever I'm trying to optimize my thyroid, because overall, naturally, I tend to sit a little bit of a hypothyroid state. That's governed by my I use my total T3 levels, which tend to come in at about 0.7, which is just slightly hypothyroid, not much, just above. It's in normal range, but I would probably suboptimal, especially if I'm in the opportunity of trying to lose fat. That suboptimal level works great in Louisiana's heat because it's always hot as hell outside. So if my thyroid's running a little lower, the heat probably doesn't bother me as much. Maybe it runs lower because it's so damn hot outside. However, if I'm trying to cut weight and I'm trying to lose body fat and I want to have my metabolism optimized, then I'm going to want to make sure that my iodine levels, my selenium levels, iron, and tyrosine are at an optimal level. What I've typically used is something called tyrosine from Thorne, because it basically contains all of those ingredients individually put in it. So instead of taking 5 bottles, I can just use one. And I find sometimes I will use an additional iodine supplement because, let's be honest, I don't eat a lot of seaweed and I don't eat a lot of kelp. And I feel sorry if you do. So for me, it's a lot easier to get my iodine from a supplement. However, I do recognize the importance of having iodine, so I supplement it in. Now, the problem is you can have all of those ingredients in your body, yet if your brain doesn't tell your thyroid to make it, ain't nothing baking. So how do we get our brain to tell it? We need to trick our body and make our body believe it's cold. Now, personally, I am a big fan of cold water immersion. The idea is that I'll sit in a cold plunge, typically that's at 40 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, for 3 to 5 minutes. You don't need longer, because longer is not necessarily better. It might feel better. It makes you feel all David Goggins and shit because you sat in there longer. However, the reality is you need about 3 to 5 minutes. You need to get it cold, and you need to be cold long enough so that your brain recognizes it. Because in the first stage, when the water, let's say in cold water immersion, and you get down into the water, the very first thing that happens is all of the nociceptors or pain receptors in your body begin to send an emergency signal to the brain. It says, hey dog, you've done fallen in cold water and you need to do something about it. So your brain begins to release extra dopamine. Remember from the fat burning process, dopamine's a catecholamine. That's going to trigger the fat cells to release. So your body can pump some triglycerides into the blood to begin to raise some fuel for burning. Next, that dopamine's helping your brain focus. It's saying, hey, you've got a crisis situation and you need to figure out how to get out of it. Stage 2, which is the part I enjoy, is your body begins to release endorphins. Those endorphins begin to circulate because as long as the pain's screaming from the cold water, your brain can't focus. So the endorphins calms the pain so the dopamine can focus the brain. By doing that, your body's saying, okay, now I've got you in a good situation to get out of this awful cold water. Typically at about 2 to 3 minutes, at about 3.5 minutes, what's going to happen is your body recognizes, wait a minute, this idiot can't find his way out of the cold water. So your brain sends a signal to the thyroid or sends thyroid stimulating hormone from the brain to the thyroid and says, hey, we're going to need a lot more thyroxine and T3 pumped into the body because we need to raise the core temperature because remember, our bodies like it at 98.6. Our body's very picky about that. It has something called homeostasis, which means that it tries to keep itself balanced and in check. So what happens is we're in water that's a large differential. As that cold hits, the brain begins to trigger a release. Thyroid stimulating hormone is released to the thyroid. The thyroid says, hey, we've got to get in high gear. This is why the supplements become so important, because if you've got the nutrients available and there's plenty of levels, your iodine levels are plenty, you've got an optimized selenium and there's free tyrosine circulating, your body then incorporates that into thyroglobulin, a large protein inside of the thyroid that begins to use the enzyme thyroperoxidase and begins to form those dimers of the tyrosine, the diodenated tyrosine residues, to pump it out into the bloodstream, into the brown fat, into other organs to basically begin to raise the metabolic rate. So basically combining the supplements with the cold water immersion, you're able to generate it. One of the unique things, as I said before, my T3, total T3 tends to operate at about 0.6 to 0.7, sometimes as high as 0.8. I've found that by combining the supplements with the nutrients, I'm able to push my T3 up to 1.2, 1.3, which is in a peak optimal range. It's very interesting how I accidentally discovered this with the cold water immersion was using Clinicore's One Touch. I was able to monitor my TSH. I often check my hormones after I'd finished working out in the gym in the morning. I kept noticing that my TSH was coming in really high, but my T3 and T4 were just normal. And I kept thinking, well, I'm not hypothyroid. I don't really feel like I'm fully hypothyroid. What's going on? And so what we noticed was that about 3.5, 4 minutes, my thyroid, my TSH would go from 2.5, 2.7 to 5.5 to 6, meaning that my brain was sending a massive signal to the thyroid. However, I was deficient in iodine and I wasn't having any type of selenium supplementation. So my body did not have the ability to pick up the T3 and T4. Once I added the supplements to it, the combination increased my metabolic rate so that I nearly doubled my T3, which is the active ingredient that we're after to increase our metabolism. And the amazing part about it is I was able to increase my T3 without actually having to take T4 or T3, which would have blunt my brain's signal to the actual thyroid. So what we're talking about is a way of optimizing, biohacking, and improving your body so that it can function at a higher level. It's talking about being able to evolve into our next level of science so that we can be the best version of ourselves. And that's really kind of what we focused on Core Health. We begin to test it other athletes. We've tested 5 to 7 people. We found the same thing. Cold water immersion generates the thyroid stimulating hormone signal necessary to tell the thyroid to get busy. Once those supplements and brought to an adequate level, in the actual athlete, we find the same response in their T3 and T4 levels. This is going to be extremely helpful for losing fat, because when your thyroid level, when your basal metabolic rate is at a higher level, you're going to burn more calories sitting still than you did without it. So on the days that I do the supplements with the cold plunge, even though I may be at my computer working, I'm burning more calories then than I am if I was just without the supplements and without the cold water immersion. That's amazing because it allows me to burn more by doing the same activity. So I didn't increase my actual workout, I just increased my basal metabolic rate, and that's what we're really after. So what do you do if you don't have a cold plunge readily accessible? You've heard of taking a cold shower? It's time. I'd recommend getting the first thing in the morning, hit that cold shower. Maybe you start with it warm and then you turn all the hot water off. See how long you can go. Maybe the first time it's 30 seconds and you're like, screw this. Build up to where you can get a couple minutes. That extra spike in dopamine and that extra boost to the TSH will increase your metabolism, and that's going to give you a metabolic boost to carry you through your day so that you can operate at a higher energy and a greater level of focus so that your days go smoother. And at the end of the day, the more focused you are, the more you're going to accomplish and the more successful you can become. And so take that at heart. Remember, iodine, tyrosine, selenium, iron are your key ingredients, or you can get it all in one bottle like this with tyrosine. You can check it out on Core Health. If you're curious about your thyroid and you'd like to know, hey, what is my T3? What is my TS4? We've got our One Touch and our SVB platforms that are capable of doing it from a finger stick, or actually now have a shoulder device that we can let it on your shoulder, collect a small volume of blood. You can send it to Clinicor. They'll be able to get your TSH, T4, and T3 numbers ran. And with that, you can determine how to optimize your own, because the goal of Core Health is to make N equal 1, where you become the research participant. You become the biohacker using the combination of supplements and diagnostic tools to become the best version of yourself.